make this an especially useful conversation for you today?
Mostly I have a few questions, so I feel like answering those would be really helpful for me.
Sure, absolutely. Fire away.
Okay, so the first one that I'm kind of most concerned with is I've been practicing solely on paper so far because I'm not quite like I've practiced logic games, I've just started logical reasoning. I haven't gotten to reading comp yet, but I've only been practicing on paper. So what's the biggest difficulty going from practicing on paper to practicing for the digital LSAT?
I'm going to give you two, and
Okay.
there are ways to handle both of them. One difficulty is that you can't write on the questions themselves on the tablet, as you
Mhm.
would typically be accustomed to on a piece of paper. There are some highlighting and underlining tools on the tablet, but they don't work that well. So you want to get used to doing all your writing on scratch paper to the side.
Okay.
That's a very easy adjustment to make. So whether you're
Yeah.
using books or you're using PDFs, just don't write on the paper, write on your scratch paper to the side. You'll get a booklet of
Okay.
about 12 to 14 pages, 8.5 by 11 paper, unlined. So that's what you should practice on.
Okay.
The
That's good.
second thing is a little bit tougher, which is that you can only see one question at a time on the tablet.
Okay.
So you can just narrow your focus to one question at a time, or you can take a piece of paper, cut out a square in it that is about the size of an LSAT question, and just place that over your book.
Okay. Is that like one question, like each like logic game would be here, and then like the next part of it, like B, C, D, E, that like you can only see one of those at a time, or can you see like all of, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so you cannot see an entire game at once. You can see
Okay.
the initial paragraph and rules along with a single question of the game, but you
That's
can't
really
see all
unfortunate.
five. Yeah, no, it is unfortunate. So you got to get used to clicking left and right if you want to skip
Yeah.
to a different question in that set.
Okay. Um, so then on to logical reasoning. I've just kind of started like practicing the questions, but something that I find that I keep doing is I pick that like um kind of like tempting wrong answer that seems right, but I seem to like get down to two, like the right answer and then that kind of like purposeful one, and then I always pick the wrong one. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, sure. And this comes down, this is a common issue that students raise. And the thing is that that probably isn't entirely what's happening. There's a certain selection bias where you're not thinking of the questions where you guessed and got those right.
Hmm.
So upon your review, you got to look at everything you got wrong and also everything you had difficulty with or were not 100% confident on. And part of your review process should be to analyze what was tempting about the wrong answer that made you pick it and what ultimately makes it wrong. And what's discouraging about the right answer that pushes you away from it and what ultimately makes it correct. You want to see specifically what are the patterns in what's tricking you. You're
Okay.
not falling for all the tricks or else you get nothing right. So you have to figure out specifically what kinds of tricks are you prone to falling for? What kind of tricks are you prone to, mistakes are you prone to making? So you can
Okay.
avoid making those same mistakes again. It often comes down to, do you want moderate language or extreme language depending on the question type?
Yeah. So that would kind of apply to everything too, like every section, like find those patterns that you're making, like find those mistakes and really kind of like delve into it. Don't just be like, oh, yeah, got it wrong. Like,
Of course. Yeah. And this is the thing that's, I think, too often overlooked in LSAT prep. Students want to do lots and lots of questions and lots of exams, but don't spend enough time reviewing. But reviewing is really where the growth comes from.
okay. So like the study books that I'm using, they have like like a little section on like, this is the wrong answer. Like, this is how students pick these wrong answers. And I find that I like not like at the end after the questions, it's before you even get to the questions. It tells you these are some like mistakes that students make. But I find I skip over that because if I read it, then I tend to make those mistakes thinking like get it confused in my head. Would you recommend to read those? So what do you think about that?
If it's not helping you, then don't do it.
Okay.
I mean, I think that books are good for giving you a foundation, like an overview of the theory of the exam. But
Mhm.
once you've got that down, then you've got to focus on just doing the questions and your own review process. And after you review on your own a bit, if it's still not totally clicking, then you could look at explanations.
Okay. Um, so something else that I find I struggle with is timing. Sometimes, like especially with the logic games, sometimes I'll take 4 minutes to do a set of logic games, get them all right. Sometimes I'll take 10 minutes, get three right. Like, how do you get consistent with it? Is it just practice, practice, practice?
Well, not all games are of equal difficulty, so I wouldn't expect you to take the same amount of time for every single one. Some games are easier. That it's great if they take 6 minutes or less. So 4 minutes is an awesome time frame there. Other games might take 10 or 11 minutes, and that's to be expected.
Okay.
Now, practice is the solution, of course, and you want to focus on game types that give you trouble. And so a lot of times ordering games are easier than grouping games. So you might want to spend more time on grouping games. And then the toughest games of all that are more curveball type that don't really fit into a neat category, after you've mastered the basic types, you should focus on those too.
Okay. So just kind of practice.
Yeah, just practice.
All right. And then basically overall, like what's your best advice to get a good score, like besides practice?
That's a pretty broad question. Can we narrow it a little bit?
I think like logic games specifically, like it's kind of like hit or miss sometimes if I get them. So like what's your best advice to tackling those to get a good score on that section?
Well, for games, like I said, there's ordering, there's grouping, there's combinations of both ordering and grouping. Then there's the less common types like mapping and pattern and circle games. So focus on the basic types until you're reasonably proficient in those and scoring fairly well. Then work on the tough, rare types. And these tough, rare types have come up more often in recent years, and they really require a certain degree of adaptability and flexibility in your approach, recognizing that not everything will fit into a certain template or mold, and not all games have a ton of inferences you can make up front. A lot of games, especially these more recent tough ones, involve you doing more work and more drawing of diagrams over the course of the game. So don't expect that everything will be neatly within a template, and do lots of these curveball games so that you get used to putting yourself in difficult, uncomfortable situations and realizing that there still is an underlying logic or principle beneath the game that helps you solve it just the same.
Okay, so a lot of them now seem to be moving away from kind of like, I don't want to say inferences, but like more like hands-on, you have to do more work to get to the answer. Like so
less work up front. Like there's a lot of the older games, especially those in the 30s and even some in the 40s and 50s as well, you could do a lot of diagramming up front, draw multiple main diagrams, and then you would just basically run through the questions based on what you had drawn at the outset. Some of these newer tough games, there just isn't as much you can do up front, and it requires more holding some of these abstract rules in your head and then applying them consistently to draw more diagrams over the course of the game.
Okay, so kind of more intensive in a way, like they require more time almost.
They could take more. They could take more time, but I think the work is loaded differently. Instead of front loading the work, you're doing it bit by bit as you solve each question. So don't expect it's all going to be unlocked at the outset. There may not be a ton of inferences you can do at the very beginning. Okay,
because I find sometimes when there is a lot of inferences, I seem to always miss a few and often some really key ones. So I kind of almost like that it's shifting that way. But and then I guess going back to my question, how to get a good score, logical reasoning. I've just started kind of studying that. And like I said, I keep picking those wrong questions. What's a good way to get really familiar and with all like the different kinds of like questions that they ask?
Well, do them by type. And I have study plans that lay this out where I'll say, do read this material on must be true questions, watch this video, then do several must be true questions in a row to drill those skills and see the commonalities between questions of that type. So do a couple dozen must be truths, a couple dozen necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, and so on. So basically there's about 15 different types of logical reasoning questions. Do them by type first so that you understand the proper perspective from which to view that question type. And then once you have familiarized yourself with each of those types, then you could do them as sets of a single section where they're all scrambled up.
Okay. And then I guess the last question that I have is, do you, like once I've kind of studied everything on its own and I feel comfortable with all the sections, is it a good idea to like sit down with my like computer or tablet and my scrap paper and just like practice like doing the LSAT? Or do you think it's just better to focus on my little like sections?
Well, there are different stages of prep. So I'd say earlier in your prep, you should be doing this drilling of questions by type and familiarizing yourself with the basics of the exam. Once you've done that and you're reasonably proficient, then yes, do some individual timed sections, then do some full-length exams. And since you're doing digital, of course, you should do as much digital practice as you can. So yes, at that point, use the tablet, ideally, specifically the tablet, and have your scratch paper to the side LSAC has a couple of exams on their site at familiar.lsac.org. So you can play around with the digital LSAT functionalities.
Okay.
And that's a good place to start. And then also on top of that, if you have the PDFs, you could load those onto your tablet, although it's not a perfect simulation, and do your scratch paper to the side, or even just treat your books like screens, meaning that you don't write on them at all.
Yeah, which is kind of how I've been doing it, so I can go back to them and use them again, so I can't like cheat my answers. So I have already been doing things in a separate book. So I feel like that's going to give me a bit of an advantage when I go to practicing on the digital.
Perfect.
So I don't have any other questions. Do you have anything else that you think would be helpful for me?
There's one other thought that came to mind since you're talking about logical reasoning specifically towards the end of our conversation here, which is that too many students tend to diagram too much on logical reasoning. Most question types, you should not be diagramming. Only some must be true questions, some sufficient assumption questions, and some parallels. But I would never diagram necessary assumptions, for example, or strengthen or weaken for that matter. And so don't over-rely on diagramming. It's not a substitute for thinking. Logic games, totally different story there. That diagramming should be really, your pencil should always be moving and always be, that's a way that you think by putting it on paper.
Exactly. Okay. So yeah, I was going to say, because I haven't done any diagramming for it. Like I've only done a couple, like I've done must be true and like necessary or like the most relevant. So that's good to know because yeah, I think logic games, you rely so heavily on those diagrams. And then I guess, yeah, logical reasoning, you have to think.
Yeah, you have to think more, just engage in a real world sense.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any other questions. I think this has been really helpful, especially because I'm still in the beginning stages. Yeah, thank you so much. I'll be looking forward to following your podcast and your YouTube videos, and hopefully that'll help me even more. Fantastic, Claire. I'm really glad I was able to help. What would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call today? I think, honestly, that last comment about the logical reasoning and not diagramming, because like you're so used to doing it in logic games that you think it should be something that's applied all the way through. So I think that's something that really is going to stick with me. Glad to hear. Well, please keep in touch and let me know if I can help in any way as you move forward. I will. Thank you so much. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.